They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes the victors don't win. Sometimes they just survive. And in the aftermath of a catastrophe, they bury the truth under mountains of profit and power. Today, we delve into a chapter of history that was deliberately obscured, a story of a chemical massacre that didn't just happen to India, but was facilitated by the lingering shadows of empire. We're talking about the Bhopal Gas Tragedy, the night Union Carbide's plant unleashed a toxic nightmare, and the undeniable, often overlooked role of British negligence in its devastating legacy. Imagine waking up on a cold December night, the air thick with an acrid burning smell. You cough, your eyes water, your lungs seize. Panic erupts. This wasn't a localized accident. This was a deliberate release of death. On December 2nd, 1984, over 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, a deadly chemical, streamed from Union Carbide's pesticide plant in Bhopal, India. Within hours, an estimated 3,800 people were dead. Thousands more suffered irreversible damage. Blindness, respiratory failure, birth defects that continue to plague generations. This was the single worst industrial disaster in history. But the story doesn't end with the immediate horror. It stretches back, weaving a complex web of corporate greed, regulatory failure, and a particularly insidious form of continued colonial influence. Union Carbide was an American company, yes, but its reach and its historical context extends far beyond American shores. To understand how British negligence played a role, we must go back. We must look at the economic architecture that was put in place long before 1984. India, after centuries of British rule, inherited a system where foreign corporations held significant sway, often operating with less oversight and accountability than they would have in their home countries. The British East India Company and later the Crown had established a precedent. Exploit India's resources, its markets, its labor, for profit, with minimal regard for the long-term consequences for the Indian people. This mindset, this ingrained laissez-faire approach to colonial economics, didn't magically disappear with Indian independence in 1947. It simply adapted. The Bhopal plant itself was a product of this era. Union Carbide established its Indian subsidiary in the 1960s. The technology and safety standards were often a generation behind those in the West, a pattern we've seen repeated in countless former colonies. And who were the gatekeepers, the regulators, the economic advisors in this post-colonial landscape? Many were trained in the British system, influenced by British economic theories that prioritized free markets and minimal intervention, even when the human cost was astronomical. Let's be specific. While Union Carbide was an American entity, the framework within which it operated in India, the regulatory environment, had deep roots in British colonial policy. The very concept of limited liability, which allowed corporations to shield themselves from full responsibility for their actions, was a cornerstone of British company law that was inherited and largely maintained by India. This meant that even when Union Carbide India was demonstrably failing on safety, the ultimate responsibility could be diffused, diluted, and ultimately escaped. Furthermore, the flow of capital, the investment decisions, the economic partnerships, these were often facilitated by British financial institutions and advisors who were deeply embedded in the Indian economic landscape. These were individuals and entities who understood the British system of governance and business, and who often advocated for policies that benefited foreign investment, sometimes at the expense of local environmental and safety regulations. Think of the advisors, the consultants, the financial architects of post-colonial India. Many of them had been schooled in the British tradition, a tradition that, when it came to its colonies, often saw regulation as an impediment to progress, an obstacle to the vital flow of capital. The evidence of neglect, both corporate and governmental, is stark. By the early 1980s, the Bhopal plant was notoriously unsafe. Safety systems were failing. Warnings from within the company and from local workers were ignored. In fact, just months before the disaster, a similar, though smaller, leak occurred. It was a red flag, a siren call ignored. And where was the robust oversight? Where was the stringent regulation that would have prevented such a disaster? We must ask, considering the British influence on India's post-independence economic and legal frameworks, to what extent did that legacy of lax oversight contribute to the environment where such negligence could fester? Union Carbide's parent company in the United States, according to investigative reports and court documents, knew of the dangers. They cut corners on safety to save money. They knew that the pesticides being manufactured were becoming obsolete and unprofitable, yet they continued production, leaving behind a ticking time bomb. And when disaster struck, the response was shameful. Union Carbide initially tried to blame sabotage. They downplayed the severity of the chemical. They fought tooth and nail against fair compensation for the victims. The legal battles that followed were protracted and agonizing. India sought justice, but the legal framework, partly inherited and influenced by British jurisprudence, proved inadequate to hold a powerful multinational accountable. The settlement eventually reached in 1989 was a pittance, a mere fraction of what was demanded and what was deserved. Many argue that this settlement was a direct result of the legal and economic structures that were in place, structures that favored the corporation over the victims, a legacy that can be traced back, in part, to the colonial era's emphasis on protecting foreign investment. Let's be clear. This isn't about assigning blame solely to individuals in London in 1984. This is about understanding the systemic issues. It's about recognizing how the economic and legal scaffolding that held post-colonial India together was, in many ways, a blueprint drawn from British imperial policy. A policy that prioritized the interests of the colonizer, or in this case, the foreign investor, over the well-being of the colonized, or the citizens of a developing nation. Consider the very concept of corporate social responsibility. In the West, by the 1980s, there was a nascent understanding of environmental and social accountability. This understanding was less developed, or at least less enforced, in countries like India, where the emphasis was on attracting foreign investment to fuel development. And who were the primary architects of this development strategy? Often, it was individuals and institutions steeped in the British tradition of economic liberalization, a tradition that, historically, had little patience for stringent regulation when it came to colonial territories. The disaster in Bhopal wasn't just a failure of a single company. It was a failure of a system that, in its post-colonial evolution, still bore the indelible marks of its imperial past. The British legacy wasn't just about political independence. It was also about the economic and legal structures that shaped the new nation. And in the case of Bhopal, those structures, influenced by a historical pattern of prioritizing profit over people, proved tragically inadequate. We see this pattern repeating itself across the globe in varying degrees. The extraction of resources, the exploitation of labor, the environmental degradation, these are often byproducts of economic models that have roots in colonial history. Union Carbide, though an American company, operated within a global economic framework that had been shaped by centuries of imperial power, a power wielded significantly by Britain. The pursuit of profit, unchecked by robust regulation, facilitated by legal loopholes inherited from a colonial past, led to the unthinkable in Bhopal. The fight for justice in Bhopal continues to this day. Victims and their descendants are still seeking adequate compensation, environmental cleanup, and accountability. They are fighting against a legacy of corporate impunity, a legacy that has been difficult to dismantle precisely because the foundations upon which it was built were laid so long ago, by hands that were not Indian. The Bhopal Gas Tragedy is a stark reminder. A reminder that the echoes of empire are long and often devastating. A reminder that the pursuit of profit, when untethered from ethical responsibility and robust oversight, can lead to unimaginable human suffering, and a reminder that understanding the true culprits requires looking beyond the immediate event and delving into the deeper, more uncomfortable truths of history. When we speak of Union Carbide's chemical massacre, we must also acknowledge the silent complicity, the systemic enablement that allowed such a tragedy to unfold. We must ask ourselves, are we truly free from the shadows of the past, or are we still operating within frameworks that perpetuate its injustices? The victims of Bhopal deserve more than just a footnote in history. They deserve a full reckoning, a reckoning that includes understanding the full spectrum of forces that contributed to their suffering. And that reckoning, inevitably, must include the undeniable and often overlooked role of British negligence in shaping the very conditions that made Bhopal possible. We must never forget Bhopal, and in remembering, we must strive to ensure that the lessons learned from this devastating disaster are not buried, but etched into the very fabric of our global conscience. For in the quiet corners of the world, the ghosts of chemical nightmares still whisper, and the legacy of imperial economic policy continues to cast a long and often deadly shadow.